When Maria Santos blocked that devastating roundhouse kick with a lightning-fast limb destruction technique, sending 17-year-old Jake Morrison crashing into the gymnasium wall, the entire school fell silent. But what they didn't know was that their quiet Filipino literature teacher had been holding back her true identity for months, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal why you should never corner a woman whose hands are registered weapons. Let me tell you a story about modern warfare, where keyboards became battlefields and social media turned into the cruelest arena of all. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maria Santos had always been small for her age, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches in her sensible flats as she walked through the corridors of Riverside High School. It was her first week teaching English literature, and she clutched her lesson plans like a shield against the chaos that seemed to follow teenagers everywhere. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a cardigan that had seen better days paired with slacks from the clearance rack at Target. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a fresh-faced teacher trying to make it in one of California's most competitive suburban schools. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes constantly assessed her surroundings, the way she moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years of disciplined training, or how her seemingly nervous fidgeting was actually her hands unconsciously practicing the intricate movements of Filipino martial arts. Maria had learned to make herself invisible, to blend into the background until the moment action was required. It was a skill that had kept her alive in more dangerous places than a high school hallway, and it was about to serve her well in ways she never imagined. Riverside High was the kind of place where parking lots showcased luxury cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The student body was a carefully curated collection of the wealthy and ambitious, kids whose parents had moved to this particular district specifically for its reputation and college acceptance rates. The hallways gleamed with fresh paint and motivational posters about excellence and achievement, while the trophy cases overflowed with evidence of the school's athletic and academic dominance. It was a place where image mattered more than substance, where social media followers translated to social currency, and where being different was the greatest sin you could commit. Jake Morrison ruled this kingdom with the casual confidence of someone who had never known failure. At 17, he was already 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders of a natural athlete and the kind of smile that made teachers forget he hadn't done his homework. His father owned the largest construction company in Riverside County, and his mother Karen sat on every important committee in town, from the PTA to the City Planning Commission. Jake had grown up understanding that the world was his playground, and that rules were suggestions that applied to other people. He held court in the cafeteria every lunch period, surrounded by his loyal following of teammates and admirers. His girlfriend Ashley Chen was a social media sensation with over 50,000 followers on Instagram, known for her carefully curated lifestyle posts and her ability to destroy someone's reputation with a single story. Together, they formed the nucleus of Riverside High's social hierarchy, the couple that everyone either wanted to be or wanted to be with. Maria's first interaction with Jake came during her second day of teaching. She had been explaining the themes of persecution and redemption in To Kill a Mockingbird, when Jake's hand shot up in the back of the room. His question seemed innocent enough on the surface, but Maria caught the subtle mockery in his tone, the way his classmates exchanged glances when he asked about her accent, wondering if she had learned English as a second language. She had handled it with grace, explaining that she was born in San Francisco, but that her parents had immigrated from the Philippines when they were young. What she didn't mention was that those same parents had insisted she learn not just their language and culture, but also their martial traditions. Every morning before school, every evening after homework, Maria had trained in the ancient Filipino art of Arnis under the watchful eye of her grandfather, a man who had fought in actual battles, and understood that the greatest weapon was often the one your opponent never saw coming. The harassment began subtly, the way it always does in the digital age. Maria started noticing students whispering and looking at their phones when she entered the room. She caught fragments of conversations that seemed to involve her name, followed by muffled laughter and quickly hidden screens. When she asked David Kim, one of the quieter students who always seemed to know what was happening in the social media ecosystem, he just shook his head and muttered something about not wanting to get involved. But Maria had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Daly City, where survival meant paying attention to threats before they materialized. She had learned to read the signs of impending violence, whether it came from street gangs or high school bullies. The difference was that these kids fought with keyboards instead of knives, and their weapons were carefully crafted lies designed to destroy rather than defend. The fake dating profile appeared on a Thursday. Maria discovered it the way most victims do, through the concerned message of a friend who had seen something disturbing online. The profile used her professional headshot from the school website, the one that had been taken during new teacher orientation. But whoever had created it had crafted an elaborate fiction around her image, describing her as desperate and lonely, looking for casual encounters with men in the Riverside area. The details were cruelly specific. The profile claimed she lived alone and was struggling financially, that she was new to the area and didn't know anyone. It painted her as vulnerable and available, someone who would be grateful for any attention. Worse, it included fabricated messages and conversations that made it seem like she was actively seeking inappropriate relationships with local men. The profile had been shared across multiple platforms, from dating apps to social media, creating a web of lies that seemed to confirm its authenticity through sheer repetition. Maria stared at her laptop screen in her small apartment, reading through the fake conversations that someone had created in her name. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of controlled anger that she had learned to channel through years of martial arts training. In Arnis, emotion was the enemy of effectiveness. You had to remain calm, assess your opponent's weaknesses, and strike with precision rather than passion. She took a deep breath and began to investigate. The profile had been created with enough technical sophistication to suggest this wasn't a simple prank. Someone had put real effort into making it convincing, using details about her life that weren't publicly available. They had researched her background, her interests, even her teaching schedule. This wasn't random bullying. It was a calculated attack designed to destroy her reputation and her career. The next morning at school, Maria noticed the change immediately. Students who had been respectful, if distant, now looked at her with a mixture of disgust and amusement. She overheard whispered conversations about that teacher and, "Did you see what she's doing online?" The fake profile had done its work, transforming her from a respected educator into a subject of ridicule and suspicion. During her lunch break, Maria sat in her empty classroom and opened her laptop. She had learned long ago that the best defense was often a strategic offense, and she had skills that these suburban warriors had never encountered. Growing up in, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her grandfather's dojo, she had learned that every opponent revealed their weaknesses if you watched carefully enough. The question wasn't whether she could fight back. It was when and how she would choose to strike. As she scrolled through the fake profile and its spreading reach across social media platforms, Maria felt the familiar calm that came before battle. These kids thought they knew her, thought they had found her weakness and exploited it. They had no idea that they had just declared war on someone who had been training for combat since she was 6 years old, someone whose ancestors had fought colonizers, and whose family had survived by being stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than their enemies. The fake profile was still gaining traction, attracting unwanted attention from men who thought they were responding to a real person. Maria's phone had started ringing with calls from strangers, and she had received dozens of inappropriate messages on her personal social media accounts. But instead of feeling defeated, she felt something else entirely, the cold satisfaction of a predator who had finally identified her prey. Tomorrow, she would begin her counterattack, but tonight, she would do what she had always done when facing a challenge. She would train, she would plan, and she would prepare to show these privileged children what happened when you targeted someone who had never learned how to lose. The morning sun filtered through the windows of room 204 as Maria Santos arranged her lesson plans with the same methodical precision she had learned from years of martial arts training. Each movement was deliberate, economical, designed to accomplish maximum effect with minimum effort. Her students wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes, but she was already studying the battlefield, noting the sight lines, the exits, the way voices carried in the acoustically challenging space. Riverside High School represented everything Maria had both admired and feared about American education. The building itself was a monument to suburban prosperity, with its gleaming floors and state-of-the-art technology integrated seamlessly into every classroom. The walls were lined with motivational posters featuring perfectly diverse groups of students achieving impossible dreams, while the trophy cases displayed decades of athletic and academic victories that spoke to the school's relentless pursuit of excellence. But Maria had learned to look beyond the surface during her years growing up in the grittier neighborhoods of Daly City. She understood that institutions like Riverside High were ecosystems, carefully balanced environments where power flowed along invisible channels, and survival depended on understanding your place in the hierarchy. The students who walked these halls carried themselves with the unconscious confidence of people who had never doubted their right to occupy space, never questioned whether their voices would be heard or their opinions valued. The first bell rang, and Maria watched as her advanced placement literature students filed into the classroom with the practiced efficiency of young people who had been navigating academic excellence since elementary school. They moved in clearly defined social clusters, each group maintaining its own internal dynamics while remaining aware of the larger social structure that governed their daily interactions. Jake Morrison entered with his usual entourage, a collection of athletes and social media influencers who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of casual performance. Even in the supposedly egalitarian environment of public education, Jake moved like royalty, nodding to some students while completely ignoring others. His girlfriend Ashley Chen glided beside him, her phone constantly in hand as she documented their lives for her thousands of followers, transforming every mundane moment into content for her carefully curated online presence. Maria noticed how the other students automatically created space for Jake's group, shifting their conversations to accommodate his presence, adjusting their energy to match his mood. It was a dance she had observed in every school, every workplace, every social gathering she had ever attended. Power, she had learned, was often less about what you could do, and more about what others believed you could do. "Good morning, everyone," Maria began, her voice carrying the slight accent that had become both her signature and her vulnerability. "Today we're going to explore the concept of identity in literature, specifically how authors use character development to reveal the difference between who we appear to be and who we really are." She moved to the whiteboard and wrote a quote in her careful handwriting. "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." The attribution read Gloria Steinem, though Maria suspected most of her students wouldn't recognize the name or understand the context. "Can anyone tell me what this quote might mean in the context of character development?" Maria asked, scanning the room with the kind of awareness that came from years of training in an art form where a moment's inattention could result in serious injury. Ashley Chen raised her hand with the languid confidence of someone who had never doubted that her thoughts were worth sharing. "It means that finding out the truth about someone can be uncomfortable, especially if they've been lying about who they are." "Interesting interpretation," Maria replied, noting how Ashley's answer seemed to carry a weight that extended beyond the literary discussion. "What about the idea that the truth can be liberating for the person telling it, even if it's difficult for others to hear?" Jake leaned back in his chair, a gesture that managed to convey both boredom and subtle challenge. "Miss Santos, are you saying that it's okay to lie to people as long as you eventually tell the truth?" The question hung in the air like a trap, and Maria felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when she sensed an attack beginning to form. In Arnis, her grandfather had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were those who disguised their aggression as casual conversation, who lulled you into dropping your guard before striking. "I'm saying that people are complex, Jake," Maria replied, her voice maintaining its steady calm, even as her hands unconsciously shifted into a more centered position. "Sometimes we make choices about what parts of ourselves to reveal based on what we think others can handle. The question for us as readers is whether we can look beyond surface impressions to understand the deeper truths about character motivation." The class proceeded without further incident, but Maria noticed the way several students kept glancing at their phones, the way conversations seemed to pause whenever she moved closer to certain groups, the subtle but unmistakable signs that something was happening beneath the surface of their normal classroom dynamic. During her lunch break, Maria made her way to the faculty lounge, a beige-walled sanctuary where teachers could briefly escape the constant performance required by their profession. She had brought her own lunch, a simple sandwich and fruit that reflected both her modest budget and her practical approach to nutrition. Around her, other teachers discussed lesson plans and administrative policies with the weary expertise of people who had learned to navigate bureaucracy while maintaining their passion for education. "How are you settling in?" asked Sarah Martinez, the Spanish teacher who had been assigned as Maria's unofficial mentor during her first weeks at Riverside High. Sarah was a veteran educator with 15 years of experience and the kind of classroom management skills that came from understanding adolescent psychology at a fundamental level. "It's challenging," Maria admitted, taking a small bite of her sandwich. "The students are academically gifted, but there's a social dynamic here that's different from what I expected." Sarah nodded knowingly. "Riverside kids are different from most places. They're used to being the smartest, the most successful, the most connected. Sometimes that creates a sense of entitlement that can be difficult to manage. The key is consistency. Set your boundaries early and stick to them, no matter who their parents are or what kind of influence they think they have." Maria appreciated the advice, but she sensed that Sarah's understanding of the situation was incomplete. The older teacher saw the challenges of Riverside High through the lens of traditional classroom management, focusing on academic engagement and behavioral standards. She hadn't grown up in an environment where social warfare was a daily reality, where the wrong word or gesture could result in systematic destruction of your reputation and livelihood. The afternoon brought Maria's most challenging class, a group of juniors who had been placed in advanced placement literature despite showing more interest in their social media presence than their academic performance. This was where Jake Morrison held court, where Ashley Chen's influence was most pronounced, where the complex dynamics of teenage social hierarchy played out in real time. "Today we're going to discuss the Scarlet Letter," Maria announced, noting the immediate eye rolls and dramatic sighs that greeted this announcement. "I know it's not the most popular assignment, but Hawthorne's exploration of public shame and hidden identity is particularly relevant to our current social media culture." She moved to the front of the classroom, positioning herself where she could see all the students while maintaining quick access to the door. It was a habit she had developed years ago, always knowing her exit routes, always maintaining situational awareness. The story centers on Hester Prynne, a woman who is publicly shamed for adultery while the identity of her partner remains hidden, Maria continued. "What's interesting is how the community uses public humiliation as a form of social control, and how that humiliation can sometimes reveal more about the accusers than the accused." Jake's hand shot up with the kind of theatrical timing that suggested he had been planning his intervention. "Miss Santos, do you think people deserve to be shamed when they do things that go against community standards?" The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Maria caught the undercurrent of something more calculated. Around the room, students were paying attention with the kind of intensity that suggested they were witnessing more than a casual classroom discussion. "That's a complex question, Jake," Maria replied, moving slightly closer to his desk while maintaining the relaxed posture that concealed her heightened state of awareness. "The novel suggests that public shaming often says more about the shamers than the shamed. People who have nothing to hide rarely feel compelled to expose others." Ashley Chen leaned forward, her phone discreetly positioned to capture the conversation. "But what about when someone is being dishonest about who they are? Don't people have a right to know the truth?" Maria felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came when she recognized the opening moves of an attack. These weren't random questions. They were probing strikes designed to test her defenses and gather information about her vulnerabilities. In the dojo, she would have already shifted into a defensive stance, but here she had to maintain the fiction of normal classroom discourse. "Interesting perspective, Ashley," Maria said, her voice carrying a slight edge that only someone trained in reading vocal stress patterns would have detected. But the novel also explores how truth and perception can be very different things. Hester's accusers believe they know her story, but they're missing crucial information that would change their understanding of the situation entirely. The class period ended with an unusual amount of energy in the room, students filing out in animated clusters while casting glances back at Maria that ranged from curiosity to something approaching anticipation. She noticed David Kim lingering near his desk, organizing his papers with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he wanted to speak with her privately. "Miss Santos," he said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone, "I think you should know that some of the students have been talking about you online." Maria felt her stomach clench, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of talking, David?" "I can't really say specifically," he replied, his discomfort evident. "But maybe you should check your social media accounts. And maybe be careful about what information you share online." The warning was cryptic but clear enough. Maria thanked David and waited until he left before opening her laptop. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same precise efficiency she brought to all her actions, navigating to her social media accounts with growing apprehension. What she found there made her blood run cold. Someone had created elaborate fake profiles using her photos and personal information, complete with fabricated conversations and fictional personal details designed to portray her as desperate, unprofessional, and sexually available. The profiles had been shared across multiple platforms, creating a web of lies that seemed to confirm their authenticity through sheer repetition. Maria stared at the screen, reading through conversations she had never had, seeing her face attached to words she had never spoken. The sophistication of the attack was impressive in its cruelty, designed not just to embarrass her but to systematically destroy her professional reputation and personal dignity. For a moment she felt the familiar surge of anger that had gotten her into trouble during her younger years, the same rage that had driven her to train harder, fight longer, and push herself beyond normal human limitations. But then she remembered her grandfather's teachings about the difference between reaction and response, between emotional impulse and strategic action. She closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where expensive cars glittered in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in this building, students were probably laughing about their clever attack, congratulating themselves on their technical prowess and social media savvy. They thought they had found her weakness, exploited her vulnerability, reduced her to a victim of their sophisticated cyberbullying campaign. What they didn't understand was that they had just declared war on someone whose ancestors had survived colonization, whose family had fought their way out of poverty through discipline and determination, whose grandfather had taught her that the most dangerous opponent was the one who appeared to be losing, right up until the moment they struck back. Maria smiled, an expression that would have been familiar to anyone who had ever faced her in combat. Tomorrow she would begin her counterattack. But tonight, she would do what she had always done when facing a challenge. She would train, she would plan, and she would prepare to teach these privileged children the difference between playing games and engaging in actual warfare. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot of the Riverside Community Center as Maria Santos pushed through the heavy glass doors, her gym bag slung over her shoulder with practiced ease. The building was a far cry from the gleaming modernity of Riverside High, with its worn linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally, but it had something the school lacked: authenticity. This was where real work happened, where people came not to perform but to transform themselves through discipline and dedication. The Filipino-American Cultural Center occupied the east wing of the building, a modest space that had been converted from what was once a small banquet hall. The walls were decorated with photographs of Filipino heroes and traditional artwork, while the corner held a small shrine to Saint Michael the Archangel, patron saint of warriors and protector of those who fight for justice. The scent of incense mixed with the familiar smell of well-worn training mats, creating an nine-page atmosphere that immediately transported Maria back to her childhood in her grandfather's dojo. Lolo Ernesto Santos was already there, moving through his warm-up routine with the fluid grace of someone who had been practicing the same movements for over 60 years. At 78, he remained remarkably fit, his body maintaining the lean strength that came from a lifetime of martial arts training. His weathered hands moved through the air with precise geometry, each strike and block executed with the kind of muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. "You're late, Hapo," he said without turning around, using the Tagalog term of endearment that had always made Maria feel connected to her cultural heritage. "And you're carrying tension in your shoulders. What happened today?" Maria dropped her bag and began her own stretching routine, feeling the familiar comfort of ritual and tradition. Her grandfather had always been able to read her emotional state through her physical posture, a skill that came from decades of training students to understand the connection between mental state and physical performance. "Some students at school have been targeting me," she said, rolling her shoulders to release the knots that had formed during her day of hypervigilance. "They created fake profiles online, made it look like I was doing inappropriate things. It's sophisticated harassment, designed to destroy my reputation." Lolo Ernesto paused in his routine, his dark eyes studying his granddaughter with the intensity of someone who had survived actual combat. He had fought in the mountains of Luzon during his youth, had trained with masters who understood that martial arts were not sport but survival, had passed down techniques that were meant to end conflicts decisively and permanently. "Show me," he said simply, gesturing toward the training area where wooden weapons hung from hooks along the wall. "Show me how you feel." Maria selected a pair of rattan sticks, testing their weight and balance, with the automatic assessment of someone who had been handling weapons since childhood. The sticks were extensions of her arms, tools that allowed her to channel her emotions into productive action rather than destructive rage. She moved into the center of the mat and began the flowing sequences of Arnis, each movement a conversation between aggression and control. The art of Arnis was born from centuries of Filipino resistance against colonization, a martial system that had evolved from the practical need to defend against better armed and better funded invaders. It was a fighting style that emphasized adaptability, using whatever weapons were available while maintaining the philosophical foundation that true strength came from understanding rather than brute force. Maria had learned these lessons alongside her alphabet, absorbing the culture of resilience that had allowed her people to survive wave after wave of attempted conquest. "Your form is good," Lolo Ernesto observed, watching as Maria executed a complex sequence of strikes and blocks. "But you're fighting ghosts instead of opponents. In combat, you must see clearly, think strategically, act decisively. Emotion clouds judgment. Anger makes you predictable." Maria completed her sequence and bowed to her grandfather, feeling the familiar centering that came from physical exertion, combined with mental focus. "They think they know who I am, Lolo. They see a small, quiet teacher and assume I'm helpless. They don't understand that I've been training for situations like this my entire life." "Then you must teach them," he replied, moving to the weapons rack and selecting a pair of sticks for himself. "But not through demonstration. Through education. The greatest victory is the one that transforms your enemy into your student." They began to spar, grandfather and granddaughter moving through the intricate dance of attack and defense that had been passed down through generations of their family. Maria had learned these techniques as a child, but it wasn't until she faced real adversity that she understood their deeper meaning. Arnis wasn't just about physical combat, it was about mental resilience, about maintaining your center when everything around you was chaos. "Tell me about these students," Lolo Ernesto said between exchanges, his breathing steady despite the intensity of their training. "What do they want? What do they fear?" Maria blocked a lightning-fast strike and countered with a technique that would have been devastating in a real fight. "They want to maintain their position in the social hierarchy. They fear anything that threatens their sense of superiority. I represent something they don't understand, so they're trying to destroy me before I can challenge their assumptions." "And what is your goal?" he asked, switching to a different weapon configuration that required Maria to adapt her defensive strategy. "Revenge? Justice? Education?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, complex and layered with meaning. Maria had been asking herself the same thing since discovering the fake profiles, trying to separate her immediate emotional response from her long-term strategic objectives. Revenge would be satisfying, but ultimately empty. Justice would require working within systems that were often biased against people like her. Education offered the possibility of real change, but it required patience and wisdom that felt almost impossible when she was under active attack. "I want them to understand that their actions have consequences," she said finally, executing a disarming technique that left her grandfather's weapons on the mat. "But I also want to change the environment that makes this kind of behavior possible. I want other teachers, other students who don't fit the conventional mold, to feel safe expressing their authentic selves." Lolo Ernesto nodded approvingly, retrieving his weapons with the fluid motion of someone who had been disarmed countless times during his years of training. "Then you must think like a strategist, not a warrior. You must understand your opponent's strengths and weaknesses, their resources and limitations. You must plan not just for immediate victory, but for lasting change." They continued training for another hour, moving through increasingly complex scenarios that tested Maria's ability to adapt and respond under pressure. Her grandfather introduced variables that simulated real-world chaos: multiple attackers, confined spaces, weapons that broke or became unavailable. Situations where retreat was impossible and victory required creativity rather than conventional technique. "In the mountains, we learned that the enemy's greatest weapon was often their assumptions," he said, as they began their cool-down routine. "They assumed we were primitive, that we lacked sophisticated strategy. that we would respond to pressure in predictable ways. We used those assumptions against them, appearing weak when we were strong, seeming disorganized when we were carefully coordinated. Maria absorbed this wisdom as she cleaned and stored the training weapons, understanding that her grandfather was offering her more than martial arts instruction. He was sharing the accumulated knowledge of a people who had survived by being smarter and more adaptable than their oppressors, who had turned disadvantage into advantage through careful observation and strategic thinking. "What do you know about these students beyond their harassment?" he asked, as they prepared to leave the training area. "What are their vulnerabilities? What do they value most? What would they be willing to sacrifice to protect?" Maria considered the question as she gathered her belongings, thinking about Jake Morrison's obvious need for social approval, Ashley Chen's dependence on her online image, the way both of them seemed to derive their sense of self-worth from their ability to control others' perceptions. They were powerful within their limited environment, but that power was based on maintaining an illusion of invulnerability. They're afraid of being exposed, she realized, the insight hitting her like a physical blow. Their entire social structure depends on maintaining certain narratives about themselves and others. They attack people like me because we represent authenticity in a world built on performance. "And what happens when performance meets authenticity?" Lolo Ernesto asked, smiling with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had grasped a fundamental truth. "Authenticity wins," Maria replied, "but only if it's backed by strength and strategy." As they walked out of the community center into the cooling evening air, Maria felt a shift in her understanding of the situation. The fake profiles, the harassment, the systematic attempt to destroy her reputation weren't random acts of teenage cruelty. They were defensive maneuvers by people who recognized, perhaps unconsciously, that she represented a threat to their carefully constructed world. Her grandfather had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were those who feared you, because fear made people desperate, and desperate people were capable of escalating beyond all reason. But fear also created opportunities for those who understood how to exploit it strategically. Jake Morrison and Ashley Chen had revealed their own vulnerabilities through their attack on her, showing her exactly where they were strongest and, more importantly, where they were most fragile. The drive home gave Maria time to process the insights from her training session, to begin formulating a response strategy that would go beyond simple retaliation. She understood now that her goal wasn't to destroy these students but to transform them, to create a teaching moment that would have lasting impact not just on them but on the broader school community. Her apartment was small but comfortable, decorated with photographs from her childhood and traditional Filipino artwork that connected her to her cultural heritage. She made herself a simple dinner of rice and vegetables, eating with the mindful attention that came from years of martial arts training. Every action was deliberate, every movement purposeful, every decision part of a larger strategy that was beginning to take shape in her mind. As she prepared for bed, Maria opened her laptop one final time to examine the fake profiles that had been created in her name. But now she was looking at them with different eyes, seeing not humiliation but intelligence, not vulnerability but opportunity. These students had unknowingly provided her with a detailed map of their own psychological landscape, showing her exactly how their minds worked and what they valued most. She studied the technical sophistication of the profiles, noting the platforms they had chosen, the language they had used, the way they had constructed the false narrative. It was impressive work, requiring coordination and planning that suggested they had done this before, probably to other teachers who had lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. But Maria was not like other teachers. She had been trained from childhood to think tactically, to see conflict as a chess game where every move revealed information about your opponent's strategy. She had learned from masters who understood that the greatest victory was often the one that looked like defeat, right up until the moment of triumph. Tomorrow she would begin her counterattack. But it would not be the crude retaliation that these students expected. Instead, it would be something far more sophisticated. A teaching moment that would transform not just the immediate situation, but the culture that had made such attacks possible in the first place. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her center, who understood her mission, and who possessed the skills necessary to accomplish her goals. The students at Riverside High thought they were dealing with a vulnerable teacher who could be easily intimidated. Tomorrow they would begin to learn who Maria Santos really was. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that California mornings offered. But Maria Santos felt the weight of invisible eyes as She walked through the hallways of Riverside High School. The fake profiles had been circulating for less than 24 hours, but in the accelerated timeline of social media, that was long enough for rumors to crystallize into accepted truth. Students who had previously offered polite nods now averted their gazes, while others watched her with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. Maria moved through the corridors with the same measured pace she always maintained, but her awareness was heightened to the level of combat readiness her grandfather had drilled into her since childhood. Every conversation that stopped when she approached, every phone that was quickly tucked away, every whispered exchange between students registered in her consciousness like sonar pings mapping the terrain of a hostile environment. The faculty lounge offered no sanctuary. When Maria entered to retrieve her morning coffee, the usual chatter among her colleagues diminished to an uncomfortable murmur. She could feel their uncertainty, their professional concern, mixing with personal discomfort as they tried to reconcile the woman they knew with the online persona that had been fabricated in her name. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with suspicion, and a few with the kind of disappointed resignation that suggested they had already accepted the false narrative as truth. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian who had always been friendly during Maria's brief tenure at the school, approached with the careful deliberation of someone delivering bad news. "Maria, honey, I think you should know that some parents have been calling the school. They're concerned about the social media situation." Maria accepted this information with the same calm expression she wore during Arnis training, when her grandfather would announce that he was about to attempt a particularly challenging technique. "I appreciate you telling me, Mrs. Henderson. What kind of concerns are they expressing?" "Well, they're worried about appropriateness, about whether someone with that kind of online presence should be teaching their children." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried genuine regret, as if she understood the unfairness of the situation but felt powerless to change it. "I know it's not fair, but you know how these things go. People see something online and they assume it's true." The morning bell interrupted their conversation, and Maria made her way to her first period class with the knowledge that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated performance. The students had positioned themselves strategically around the room, creating sightlines that would allow them to observe her reactions while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement in the harassment campaign. Jake Morrison sat in his usual seat, but his posture radiated the kind of aggressive confidence that came from believing he held all the advantages. His girlfriend Ashley Chen occupied the desk beside him, her phone positioned to capture whatever humiliation they expected to unfold. Around them, their allies had arranged themselves like a supporting cast in a play they had written and directed. "Good morning, everyone," Maria said, her voice carrying the same steady authority it always had. "Today we're going to continue our discussion of character development in American literature, specifically focusing on how authors reveal the true nature of their characters through moments of crisis." She wrote a new quote on the whiteboard, her handwriting maintaining its characteristic precision despite the tension in the room. "The measure of a man is not how he behaves in moments of comfort and convenience, but how he stands at times of controversy and challenges." Martin Luther King, Jr. The silence that followed was different from the usual classroom quiet. It was charged with anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to vibrate with potential energy. Maria could feel the students' excitement, their belief that they were about to witness her breakdown, their anticipation of the moment when their carefully constructed attack would achieve its intended effect. "Can anyone tell me what Dr. King might have meant by this observation?" Maria asked, scanning the room with the same tactical awareness she brought to sparring matches. "How do we determine someone's true character?" Ashley Chen's hand shot up with theatrical eagerness. "I think it means that people show their real selves when they're under pressure. Like, when someone's reputation is challenged, you get to see who they really are underneath all the pretending." The comment landed with the precision of a targeted strike, and Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with recognizing the opening move of a coordinated attack. But instead of responding with the emotional reaction her students expected, she smiled with the kind of calm appreciation that came from watching a skilled opponent reveal their strategy. "That's a very insightful observation, Ashley," Maria replied, moving closer to the girl's desk with the fluid grace that marked all her movements. "You're absolutely right that pressure reveals character. But I think Dr. King was making a more specific point about the difference between authentic character and performed identity." She paused, letting her words settle over the classroom like morning mist. When we perform identity, we're essentially creating a fiction about ourselves that's designed to manipulate how others perceive us. But authentic character is what remains when all the performance is stripped away. When we're forced to respond to challenges with our true selves rather than our constructed personas. Jake Morrison leaned forward, his eyes bright with a kind of predatory intelligence that came from sensing weakness. Miss Santos, that's interesting because it seems like a lot of people these days are living double lives. Like, they present one version of themselves in professional settings and completely different versions online. Don't you think that's kind of dishonest? The question hung in the air like a trap, beautifully constructed and perfectly timed. Maria recognized the technique from her martial arts training, where opponents would feint in one direction before attacking from another, using misdirection to create openings for decisive strikes. But she also understood that Jake had just revealed more about his own strategy than he realized. "That's a fascinating perspective, Jake," she said, her voice carrying undertones that only someone trained in reading vocal stress would detect. "You're touching on something that philosophers have discussed for centuries. The question of whether we have a single authentic self or whether identity is actually constructed through our interactions with different communities and contexts." She moved to the center of the classroom, positioning herself where she could observe all the students while maintaining what appeared to be a casual teaching posture. For example, the way you communicate with your teammates on the football field is probably different from how you interact with your grandmother at family dinner. Does that make you dishonest, or does it make you adaptive? The question caught Jake off guard, and Maria watched as he struggled to maintain his aggressive posture while processing the implications of her response. She had turned his attack back on him, using his own logic to create a philosophical trap that would be difficult to escape without acknowledging the complexity of the issue he had tried to oversimplify. But there's a difference between adapting to different social contexts and actively deceiving people, Ashley interjected, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who felt the conversation slipping away from her control. Like, if someone creates a fake online persona that's completely different from who they really are, that's not adaptation, that's fraud. Maria felt the familiar rush of recognition that came from watching an opponent commit to a line of attack that would ultimately expose their own vulnerabilities. Ashley was describing exactly what she and her friends had done in creating the fake profiles, but she was attributing the behavior to Maria in an attempt to make her defensive and reactive. "You're absolutely right, Ashley," Maria said, her tone carrying the kind of approval that teachers used when students made particularly insightful observations. "Creating false personas to deceive others is a form of fraud. It's also a form of violence, because it's designed to harm the reputation and emotional well-being of the person being impersonated." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the classroom. But I think what's even more interesting is the psychology behind that kind of behavior. What would motivate someone to invest the time and energy required to create elaborate false narratives about another person? What kind of internal emptiness would drive someone to find meaning through the systematic destruction of others? The silence that followed was different from the anticipatory quiet that had marked the beginning of class. This was the silence of people who had suddenly realized that their carefully planned attack was being turned against them, that their victim was demonstrating a level of psychological sophistication they hadn't expected. David Kim, who had been sitting quietly in the middle of the room, raised his hand tentatively. "Miss Santos, do you think people who create fake profiles are trying to hide something about themselves? Like, maybe they're projecting their own insecurities onto other people?" The question was innocent enough, but Maria recognized it as a lifeline thrown by someone who understood the dynamics of the situation and wanted to offer support without directly confronting the aggressors. She smiled at David with genuine warmth, appreciating his courage in speaking up despite the social risks. "That's a very mature observation, David," she said. "Psychological projection is definitely a factor in cyberbullying behavior. When people feel insecure about their own authenticity, they sometimes attack others who seem to possess the genuine qualities they lack." Jake Morrison's face had taken on the kind of rigid expression that came from trying to maintain composure while feeling increasingly exposed. "Miss Santos, it sounds like you're making a lot of assumptions about people's motivations. Maybe some people just think that teachers should maintain professional standards, both in and out of the classroom." The comment was delivered with the kind of calculated innocence that marked sophisticated manipulation, but Maria recognized it as a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. Jake was trying to frame his harassment as moral concern, to justify his cruelty as righteous enforcement of professional standards. "You're absolutely right that teachers should maintain professional standards," Maria replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from absolute confidence in her position. "But I think the more important question is who gets to define those standards, and whether they're applied equally to all teachers, regardless of their background, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status." She moved closer to Jake's desk, not in a threatening manner but with the kind of focused attention that made it clear she was addressing him specifically. For example, if someone created fake online profiles designed to make a teacher appear unprofessional, would that be considered an attack on professional standards? Or would it be considered an attack on the teacher's right to be treated with dignity and respect? The question hit its target with surgical precision, and Maria watched as Jake's confident expression flickered for just a moment before he regained his composure. But that momentary lapse was enough to confirm what she had suspected. He was beginning to understand that his opponent was not the vulnerable victim he had expected, but something far more dangerous. "I think," Jake said carefully, "that teachers who put inappropriate content online should expect consequences for their actions." "And I think," Maria replied with the kind of smile that her grandfather would have recognized as a warning signal, "that students who create fake content designed to destroy their teachers' reputations should expect to learn some very important lessons about the difference between actual power and the illusion of power." The bell rang, ending the class period with a tension that felt almost physical. As the students filed out, Maria noticed the way they avoided eye contact, the way their conversations seemed forced and artificial, the way Jake and Ashley exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to realize they had underestimated their target. But what they didn't understand yet was that the real lesson was just beginning. Maria had spent the class period conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about her opponent's psychological profiles and strategic capabilities. She had confirmed their involvement in the harassment campaign, identified their primary motivations, and begun the process of psychological warfare that would ultimately transform them from predators into students. As she erased the whiteboard and prepared for her next class, Maria felt the familiar calm that came from understanding her mission and possessing the skills necessary to accomplish it. The students at Riverside High thought they were dealing with a vulnerable teacher who could be easily intimidated. They were about to discover that they had declared war on someone whose ancestors had survived colonization, whose family had fought their way out of poverty through discipline and determination, and whose grandfather had taught her that the most dangerous opponent was the one who appeared to be losing right up until the moment of victory. The transformation in Maria Santos was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of predators and prey. Over the next several days, she moved through the hallways of Riverside High School with a different energy, one that made even the most confident students step unconsciously out of her path. The fake profiles continued to circulate, gaining momentum as they spread across social media platforms, but Maria's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of defensiveness or desperation, she radiated the kind of calm intensity that came from someone who had moved beyond reaction into calculated action. The harassment campaign had evolved beyond simple cyberbullying into something more sophisticated and systematic. Anonymous accounts had begun sharing the fake profiles in parent Facebook groups, tagging school board members and local community leaders. Screenshots of the fabricated conversations appeared in group chats among students, teachers, and parents, creating a web of manufactured evidence that seemed to confirm the false narrative through sheer repetition. Someone had even created a fake Instagram account that appeared to show Maria at local bars and restaurants, engaging in behavior that would be inappropriate for a teacher, though anyone with technical knowledge would recognize the images as sophisticated deepfakes. The psychological warfare was precise and well-coordinated, designed to isolate Maria from potential supporters, while building momentum for her dismissal. Phone calls to the school administration had increased dramatically, with parents demanding answers about why someone with such questionable judgment had been hired to teach their children. The local newspaper had received anonymous tips about the situation, and there were rumors that a school board meeting would be called to address the crisis. But Maria had spent her morning in meditation and training, moving through the flowing forms of Arnis with the kind of focused intensity that transformed physical exercise into spiritual preparation. Her grandfather had taught her that true warriors did not fight from anger or desperation but from a place of complete centered awareness, where every action was deliberate and every response was calculated for maximum strategic impact. She understood now that this situation was not about her personal reputation but about something much larger: the systematic way that people who challenged established power structures were neutralized through character assassination and social ostracism. The breakthrough came during her lunch period, when David Kim approached her desk with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he had been wrestling with a difficult decision. He glanced around the empty classroom to ensure they were alone before pulling out his laptop and opening a series of files that made Maria's heart race with possibility. "Miss Santos," he said quietly, "I need to show you something. I've been tracking the digital footprint of those fake profiles, and I think I know who created them." David was a slight boy with the kind of quiet intelligence that often went unnoticed in the social hierarchy of high school. But his fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who understood technology at a fundamental level. He had been working for weeks to trace the origins of the harassment campaign, using techniques that would have impressed professional cybersecurity experts. The profiles were created using a sophisticated spoofing system, he explained, his voice gaining strength as he moved into his area of expertise. But whoever did this made some mistakes. They used IP addresses that can be traced back to specific devices, and they didn't realize that some of the platforms they used automatically embed metadata that includes location and device information. Maria watched as David pulled up a complex diagram showing the digital connections between the fake profiles, the devices used to create them, and the network of accounts that had been used to spread them. The level of coordination was impressive, but it also revealed the systematic nature of the attack. This wasn't random teenage cruelty. It was a deliberate campaign designed to destroy her career and reputation. More importantly, David continued, I was able to recover some of the original conversations between the people who planned this. They thought they were using encrypted messaging, but they were actually using a platform that stores everything on servers that can be accessed if you know how to look. He opened another file, and Maria felt her blood pressure spike as she read through actual conversations between Jake Morrison, Ashley Chen, and several other students. The messages revealed not just their involvement in creating the fake profiles, but their specific motivations and strategies. They had discussed Maria's background, her accent, her apparent vulnerability, and their belief that she could be easily driven from her position without serious consequences. One message from Ashley was particularly revealing. She thinks she can just come in here and act like she belongs, but we need to remind her what happens when people don't know their place. Teachers like her are a threat to the whole system, because they make other people think they can succeed without playing by the rules. Another message from Jake was even more explicit. My mom says the school board is already getting nervous about the diversity hiring stuff. If we can make this teacher look bad enough, it'll scare them away from hiring more people like her. We're doing everyone a favor by getting rid of her before she causes more problems. Maria felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that came from understanding the true scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about personal harassment. It was about maintaining a system of exclusion that kept people like her from challenging the established order. The fake profiles were just a tactical implementation of a broader strategy designed to preserve the social hierarchy that these students and their families had built their identities around. David, she said quietly, this is incredibly brave of you to share with me. But I need you to understand that if I act on this information, there could be serious consequences for everyone involved, including you. David nodded with the kind of mature understanding that suggested he had already considered the risks. Miss Santos, I've been watching what they've been doing to you, and I know it's not going to stop with just one teacher. They did something similar to Mr. Rodriguez last year and Ms. Washington the year before that. They target anyone who doesn't fit their idea of what a teacher should look like, and they use the same techniques every time. This revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. She had assumed that she was facing an isolated incident, a group of students who had targeted her specifically because of her background and appearance. But the reality was much more systematic and disturbing. Jake Morrison and his circle had developed a repeatable process for eliminating teachers who challenged their comfort zone, and they had been using it successfully for years. What happened to Mr. Rodriguez and Ms. Washington? Maria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. They both resigned, David replied. The administration said it was for personal reasons, but everyone knew it was because of the harassment campaigns. The school board decided it was easier to let them go than to fight the parents who were complaining. Maria felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with crystalline clarity. The systematic nature of the harassment, the sophisticated technical implementation, the coordination with parent groups and community leaders, the pressure on school administration to remove the problem rather than address it. This wasn't teenage bullying. It was a carefully designed system of social control that had been refined through multiple successful implementations. But Jake Morrison and his allies had made a crucial error in their assessment of their target. They had assumed that Maria Santos was like the previous teachers they had driven away, people who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. They had no understanding of her background, her training, or the network of support that extended far beyond the boundaries of Riverside High School. "David," Maria said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from absolute certainty about her next actions. "I want you to make copies of everything you've shown me. Multiple copies, stored in different locations, with backup systems that can't be easily compromised. And I want you to document everything about how you obtained this information, so that if anyone questions its authenticity, you can demonstrate exactly how you traced it back to its sources." David nodded eagerly, understanding that he was being invited to participate in something much larger than a simple response to harassment. "What are you going to do with it?" Maria smiled with the kind of expression that her grandfather would have recognized as the moment when defensive strategy transformed into offensive action. "I'm going to teach some very important lessons about the difference between perceived power and actual power. And I'm going to make sure that what happened to Mr. Rodriguez and Ms. Washington never happens to another teacher in this district." The plan that took shape over the following days was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its comprehensiveness. Maria understood that responding to the harassment campaign with direct confrontation would only play into her opponent's strengths. They had chosen the battlefield of social media and community opinion specifically because they believed they could control the narrative and manipulate public perception to their advantage. Instead, Maria would use their own tactics against them, but with the kind of strategic sophistication that came from understanding both the technical aspects of information warfare and the psychological dynamics of power and influence. She would not simply defend herself against their attacks. She would transform the entire situation into a teaching moment that would have lasting impact on the school, the community, and potentially the broader educational system. The first phase of her counterattack began with a series of carefully crafted social media posts from her legitimate accounts. Instead of denying the false accusations or appearing defensive, she used the attention the fake profiles had generated to share her actual story. She posted photographs from her childhood in Daly City, showing her training in Arnis with her grandfather, her graduation from college, her work with community organizations, and her journey into education. Each post was accompanied by thoughtful commentary about the immigrant experience, the importance of cultural preservation, and the challenges faced by teachers from diverse backgrounds. She shared stories about her grandfather's experiences as a young man fighting for Philippine independence, her parents' struggles to build a life in America, and her own path from a working-class family to a professional educator. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Teachers from across the country began sharing their own stories of harassment and discrimination, creating a spontaneous movement that highlighted the systematic nature of the problem. Parents who had initially been concerned about the fake profiles began to question how they had been so easily manipulated, and community leaders started asking uncomfortable questions about the culture that had allowed such sophisticated bullying to flourish. But the real transformation began when Maria requested a meeting with Principal Williams, not as a victim seeking protection, but as a professional educator presenting a formal complaint about criminal harassment. She walked into his office carrying a thick folder of documentation, accompanied by David Kim and his evidence, and supported by a legal representative from the Filipino-American Legal Defense Fund. "Dr. Williams," she began, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that commanded immediate attention. "I'm here to report a systematic criminal harassment campaign that has been targeting teachers at this school for at least 3 years. The evidence I'm about to present demonstrates not only who is responsible for the current attacks on my reputation, but also their involvement in similar campaigns against previous faculty members." The principal's face went pale as Maria methodically presented the evidence David had compiled, showing the digital trail that connected the fake profiles to specific students and their devices. But the real shock came when she revealed the scope of the conspiracy, presenting evidence that several parents had been actively coordinating with their children to target teachers who didn't fit their demographic preferences. "This isn't just cyberbullying. Maria continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into the core of her presentation. This is a coordinated campaign of criminal harassment designed to maintain a system of exclusion that violates both federal civil rights laws and state educational regulations. The students involved have committed identity theft, fraud, and cyberstalking, while the parents who supported them have engaged in conspiracy to deny equal employment opportunities based on race and ethnicity. Dr. Williams sat in stunned silence as the implications of Maria's presentation sank in. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but it also revealed a level of systematic corruption that would require immediate and decisive action to address. The school district could face federal investigation, civil lawsuits, and the kind of public scrutiny that would destroy careers and reputations. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally, his voice carrying the kind of defeated acceptance that came from understanding that his comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. "I want you to follow the law," Maria replied simply. "I want the students involved to face appropriate criminal charges for their actions. I want the parents who coordinated with them to be investigated for civil rights violations. And I want this school district to implement comprehensive policies that will prevent this kind of systematic harassment from happening again." The meeting that followed involved school board members, district attorneys, federal investigators, and representatives from multiple civil rights organizations. The story that had begun as a local harassment campaign had evolved into a national conversation about cyberbullying, institutional racism, and the systematic exclusion of diverse voices from American education. Jake Morrison and Ashley Chen found themselves facing serious criminal charges for identity theft, fraud, and cyberstalking. Their parents discovered that their coordination with the harassment campaign had exposed them to federal civil rights violations that could result in substantial financial penalties and permanent criminal records. The sophisticated technical methods they had used to create and distribute the fake profiles, which they had believed would protect them from consequences, instead provided law enforcement with detailed evidence of their crimes. But the real transformation came in the days and weeks that followed, as the story spread across social media and news outlets. Teachers from across the country began sharing their own experiences with systematic harassment, creating a movement that highlighted the widespread nature of the problem. Parents who had been manipulated by similar campaigns began to recognize the techniques and question their own assumptions about the educators in their communities. The hashtag that emerged from the story, #TeachersDeserveRespect, became a rallying cry for educators who had been silenced by fear and intimidation. Maria found herself at the center of a movement that went far beyond her individual situation, speaking at conferences, testifying before legislative committees, and working with organizations dedicated to protecting the rights of teachers from diverse backgrounds. The legal consequences for Jake Morrison and Ashley Chen were severe but educational. Instead of simply facing punishment, they were required to participate in restorative justice programs that brought them face to face with the teachers they had targeted and the communities they had harmed. The process was painful and humbling, but it also provided them with opportunities to understand the impact of their actions and to begin the difficult work of making amends. Jake Morrison's transformation was particularly dramatic. Stripped of his social media platforms and facing the prospect of criminal prosecution, he was forced to confront the emptiness of his identity and the hollow nature of his achievements. The military academy where he was eventually sent provided him with the kind of structured environment that channeled his natural leadership abilities into positive directions, while the counseling he received helped him understand the psychological factors that had driven his need to dominate others. Ashley Chen's journey was more complex, involving intensive therapy to address the underlying insecurities that had driven her to build her identity around the destruction of others. The loss of her social media following and the public exposure of her harassment campaign forced her to confront the difference between authentic self-worth and the hollow validation that came from online popularity. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred within the Riverside High School community itself. The exposure of the systematic harassment campaign had revealed uncomfortable truths about the culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Parents who had previously been indifferent to issues of diversity and inclusion found themselves confronting their own biases and assumptions, while students who had been silent witnesses to bullying began to speak up and demand change. The school district implemented comprehensive reforms that went far beyond simple anti-bullying policies. They created systems for reporting and investigating harassment that protected both accusers and accused, while establishing clear consequences for behavior that violated civil rights protections. They also began actively recruiting and supporting teachers from diverse backgrounds, recognizing that educational excellence required perspectives that reflected the full spectrum of American experience. Maria's own journey continued to evolve as she moved beyond her role as a victim of harassment to become a leader in the movement for educational equity. She completed her teaching year at Riverside High School with distinction, watching as her students gradually learned to separate her authentic identity from the false narratives that had been created to destroy her reputation. Many of them, particularly those who had been silent witnesses to the harassment, approached her with apologies and requests for guidance about how to become better advocates for justice and inclusion. The community center where Maria continued to train in Arnis became a gathering place for educators and activists who were working to create more inclusive educational environments. Her grandfather, Lolo Ernesto, found himself teaching not just martial arts techniques, but also the philosophical principles that had allowed their family to survive and thrive despite systematic oppression. The lessons about discipline, strategy, and the difference between aggression and strength proved to be as relevant in modern social justice work as they had been in the mountains of the Philippines decades earlier. The ripple effects of Maria's story extended far beyond Riverside, inspiring similar movements in school districts across the country. Teachers who had been suffering in silence began to speak up about their experiences, while parents and community members started demanding accountability for the systematic harassment that had been allowed to flourish in their schools. The techniques that had been developed to silence diverse voices were exposed and countered, creating a new awareness of the sophisticated nature of modern discrimination. Federal legislation emerged from the congressional hearings that followed Maria's testimony, establishing new protections for educators and creating funding for programs that supported teachers from underrepresented communities. The law, known as the Educational Equity and Protection Act, provided both legal recourse for victims of harassment and proactive support for creating more inclusive educational environments. But beyond the legal and policy changes, Maria's story had created something even more valuable: a model for how individuals could respond to systematic oppression with strategic intelligence rather than reactive emotion. Her example showed that the most effective response to harassment was not simply to endure it or to strike back in anger, but to transform the situation into an opportunity for education and lasting change. The students who had targeted Maria found themselves studying her response in their criminal justice and social studies classes, learning about the difference between destructive and constructive uses of power. The sophisticated techniques they had used to create and distribute false information became case studies in digital literacy programs, helping other students understand how to recognize and counter similar attacks. As the school year ended, Maria stood once again in the community center where she had trained and planned her response to the harassment campaign. But now she was not alone. The space was filled with teachers, students, parents, and community members who had been inspired by her example to become active participants in creating more just and inclusive educational environments. Lolo Ernesto, now in his 80s but still moving with the grace of a lifelong martial artist, addressed the gathering with the kind of wisdom that came from decades of experience with both conflict and resolution. My granddaughter has taught us that the strongest response to hatred is not more hatred, but the kind of disciplined action that transforms enemies into students and problems into opportunities for growth. Maria looked around the room at the faces of people who had become allies in the struggle for educational equity, understanding that her individual experience had become part of a larger movement that would outlast any personal recognition or achievement. The fake profiles that had been created to destroy her reputation had instead become the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit countless other educators and students. The final lesson came months later, when Maria received a letter from Jake Morrison. He was completing his second year at military academy, and his writing showed a level of maturity and self-awareness that would have been impossible to imagine during his time at Riverside High School. The letter was not just an apology, but a commitment to using his own experience as a cautionary tale for other students who might be tempted to use their privilege and technology to harm others. "Miss Santos," he wrote, "I understand now that what I did to you was not just mean or inappropriate, but was part of a system that tries to silence anyone who challenges the comfortable assumptions of people like me. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can make sure that my story helps prevent other students from making the same mistakes. You taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not from tearing them down. Maria smiled as she read the letter, understanding that the transformation it represented was perhaps the most important victory of all. The young man who had once tried to destroy her career had become an advocate for the values she had tried to teach through her example. The cycle of harassment and exclusion had been broken, replaced by a commitment to justice and inclusion that would continue long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The story of Maria Santos and the fake profiles had become legend in educational circles, shared at conferences and training sessions as an example of how to respond to systematic harassment with strategic intelligence and moral courage. But for Maria herself, the real victory was simpler and more personal. She had remained true to her values and her mission, using her skills and training to create positive change rather than simply to defend herself. As she prepared for another school year, this time at a district that had actively recruited her because of her reputation as an advocate for educational equity, Maria reflected on the lessons she had learned and the community she had helped to create. The harassment campaign that had been designed to drive her away from teaching had instead transformed her into a leader whose influence extended far beyond any single classroom or school district. The fake profiles that had been created to destroy her reputation had become artifacts in a digital museum dedicated to understanding and preventing cyberbullying. The students who had targeted her had become case studies in restorative justice programs that emphasized healing and growth rather than simply punishment. The parents who had coordinated the harassment campaign had become advocates for policies that protected teachers from similar attacks. And Maria Santos, the quiet teacher with the Alabama accent who had seemed so vulnerable to her attackers, had become a symbol of the transformative power that came from responding to hatred with disciplined action, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to justice. Her story proved that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared to be losing right up until the moment they revealed their true strength and transformed the entire battlefield in their favor. The lesson was clear and lasting. Underestimate a teacher at your own peril, especially one whose ancestors had survived colonization, whose family had fought their way out of poverty through discipline and determination, and whose grandfather had taught her that the greatest victory was not the destruction of your enemies but their transformation into allies in the struggle for a more just and equitable world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.